Anna Rivers had never imagined that a modest wooden porch could mean so much to her. But from the moment she moved into the house, it became the silent witness to her new beginning, the small stage where the fragile balance between solitude and belonging played out each day. After her divorce, she had deliberately chosen this neighborhood because it promised quiet streets, trimmed lawns, and the kind of calm predictability she craved, yet the house itself had spoken to her in a way the others had not. Unlike the polished brick boxes around it, this one carried a history visible in its creaking boards, in the uneven white paint of the porch railing, in the way the steps dipped slightly as though bowing to every guest who had ever walked up them. Sitting there with a cup of coffee during the early mornings became a ritual. The world filtered through the sound of birds, the distant hum of sprinklers, and the occasional neighbor passing by with a polite nod. Although Anna was by nature reserved, she began to realize that the porch connected her to the community more than she had expected. From her vantage point, she could watch children on their way to school, elderly couples walking their dogs, and delivery vans winding through the cul-de-sac. Sometimes a stranger would slow down just to glance at the house, and Anna noticed how often their eyes lingered on the porch as if it held a different kind of charm from the uniform houses that surrounded it. To her, this was not simply wood and nails, but a place that gave her an anchor, a gentle assertion that her life, fractured by past mistakes, could settle into something steady again. She would sit there late at night with a lamp glowing behind the screen door, feeling the quiet weight of the dark sky above her and the faint tremors of cicadas hidden in the hedges. It felt like her own borderland between private silence and the outside world. The neighbors, at first glance, seemed courteous if somewhat restrained, bound together by the kind of unspoken agreement that everything must appear orderly. The lawns were identical, the mailboxes uniformly painted, the hedges clipped at right angles, and every holiday brought the same row of flags or lights, as though the entire street had rehearsed the act together. Anna suspected that behind this order was the Homeowners Association, a group she had heard about only in passing from the realtor, who had quickly assured her that the porch was grandfathered in and nothing she needed to worry about. At the time, Anna had dismissed it as paperwork jargon, more concerned with the mortgage than with the politics of neighborhood governance. What mattered was the feeling. The porch was where she could breathe without pretense, where she could escape the gnawing anxiety that had followed her for months after leaving her old life behind. As weeks passed, Anna began to notice subtle currents beneath the surface of neighborly politeness. There were moments when conversations halted as she walked by, when people smiled a little too tightly, when someone looked at her porch not with admiration, but with a flicker of disapproval. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was the natural reserve of a community that had known each other for years before she arrived. Still, the awareness lingered. The porch was different, an interruption in their symmetry, and that difference made her stand out more than she intended. One evening, while watering her plants, she caught sight of Edward Lawson, the HOA president, standing across the street in his tailored suit, gazing at her house with an expression that was difficult to read, neither friendly nor openly hostile, but clinical, as if assessing a problem to be solved. He turned away without a word, climbing into a sleek black car and driving off, leaving Anna with the peculiar sensation that she had been measured and found wanting. Yet, in those early days, Anna still clung to the idea that her porch was untouchable, that the whispers and stares were nothing but harmless curiosity. She had survived harder battles, endured the collapse of a marriage, the cold machinery of divorce court, the struggle of rebuilding her finances and sense of self. A porch could not be taken from her so easily, she thought. It was just a place to sit, to rest, to exist. What she did not yet know was that in this neighborhood, where appearances outweighed substance and rules held the sharpness of weapons, that small wooden structure would become both the target and the symbol of a conflict that reached far beyond a matter of property lines. The first sign that the calm she had tried so carefully to build was about to shatter arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning, when Anna stepped outside to pick up her mail and found among the grocery flyers and utility statements an envelope heavier than the rest, stamped with the seal of the Homeowners Association. She opened it while walking back toward the porch, half expecting another circular about community landscaping schedules or reminders about recycling bins. But the words inside froze her where she stood. The letter, written in the clipped, officious language of bureaucracy, informed her that the wooden porch attached to her home was deemed a non-compliant structure that violated current architectural guidelines and posed unspecified safety hazards. It ordered her to remove the entire construction within 30 days or face escalating fines and potential legal action. She read the sentences again and again, certain she had misunderstood, but the message remained brutally clear. What she considered the heart of her home was, in the eyes of the HOA, nothing more than an unauthorized eyesore scheduled for demolition. At first, disbelief insulated her from panic. The porch had been there for decades, older even than many of the other houses on the street. She had seen photographs from the original listing showing families gathered there long before she bought the property. During the purchase, her realtor had insisted it was grandfathered in, a term Anna only vaguely grasped but had taken to mean safe and legal. Now she wondered whether that reassurance had been a casual dismissal meant to close the sale quickly. Anger began to swell beneath her confusion as she realized the HOA had not even bothered to phrase the letter as an inquiry or request, but as a verdict already passed. It was not an invitation to discuss. It was an order. She spent that day pacing between rooms, the letter folded and refolded until the paper grew soft in her hands. Questions multiplied like storm clouds. Why now? Why her? Was the porch really the issue, or was there something else beneath the surface? She called the number listed at the bottom of the page, but after being transferred through a chain of disinterested voices, she was told curtly that all appeals must be submitted in writing, and that precedents cannot be considered. The tone was final, as if a door had been slammed shut in her face. She hung up the phone with the sense that she was already losing a battle she had barely begun to fight. The following evening, she attended a community meeting at the association hall, a sterile building with beige walls and a faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. Residents sat in neat rows, nodding politely as the board discussed shrub heights, noise complaints, and the budget for repainting street signs. When Anna's turn came to raise her concern, she stood, her voice trembling as she explained that her porch had existed long before her ownership, that she had been told it was compliant, and that removing it would not only be financially crippling, but emotionally devastating. For a moment, the room was silent, her words hovering in the air, and she saw flickers of sympathy in the faces of some neighbors. But Edward Lawson, the HOA president seated at the center of the long table, leaned forward with a faint smile that carried no warmth and announced in a measured tone that the board had reviewed all relevant documents and the matter was closed. "Rules are not negotiable," he said, his eyes fixed on her like a predator's. "Your feelings do not exempt you from compliance." A murmur ran through the room, but no one openly supported her. A woman she had chatted with once while walking her dog looked away quickly, and a man 2 rows back shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. The silence of her neighbors was louder than Lawson's words, pressing down on her with the weight of complicity. Anna sat back down, her cheeks burning, realizing she was alone against an entity that spoke with one voice but operated through the fear of many. That night, as she sat on the disputed porch, she felt the boards beneath her as if, for the first time, every creak a reminder of their precarious existence. She wondered whether Lawson had chosen her deliberately, whether she was being tested as the newcomer without allies. The porch had made her visible, distinct from the uniform houses around her, and perhaps that was its true crime in the eyes of the association. It broke the symmetry. It refused to blend in. She began to recall the lingering looks from passers-by, the way conversation stopped when she appeared, the calculating stare Lawson had given her weeks earlier. It all fell into place now, not as coincidence, but as the slow tightening of a noose. Over the next days, the pressure grew more tangible. A second letter arrived, this one outlining the financial penalties she would incur for each week of non-compliance, the numbers climbing with mechanical cruelty. Someone left a pamphlet about approved exterior designs in her mailbox, its glossy images of sterile, identical porches mocking the individuality of her own. Once, returning from work, she found a bright orange notice taped to her door, declaring her property under review. It felt like vandalism cloaked in official language, a scarlet mark meant to shame her publicly. She pulled it down with shaking hands, aware that neighbors had likely seen it before she did. Still, a part of her refused to accept defeat. She began digging through the box of papers she had received at closing, hunting for any document that could shield her. Amid mortgage forms and insurance policies, she found a crumpled sheet signed by the previous owner, stating that the porch had been inspected and approved under earlier regulations. The discovery gave her a surge of hope, but when she called the HOA office to mention it, the receptionist's voice turned icy. "Our current bylaws supersede outdated agreements," she was told flatly, as though history itself could be erased at their convenience. Sleep became fragmented, each creak of the porch outside her window sounding like a countdown to its destruction. She imagined contractors arriving without warning, dismantling the boards while she stood powerless. Her thoughts spiraled into darker territories. What if they were not only after her porch, but after her entirely, using technicalities to push her out of the neighborhood? She remembered something Lawson had said at the meeting, almost casually. "Your compliance determines your place here." The words echoed like a threat, suggesting that in this meticulously ordered community, dissent itself was the real violation. By the end of the month, Anna realized the porch was no longer just wood and nails. It had become the line she was being forced to draw, the battleground on which she would either surrender to the suffocating order of the HOA or fight to preserve not only a structure but the dignity of owning something truly hers. The letter that had arrived so coldly was not a simple notice. It was a declaration of war disguised as administrative routine, and it had placed her directly in the crosshairs of the most powerful man in the neighborhood. Anna had expected resistance, but nothing prepared her for the icy wall she met when she tried to confront the HOA formally. The morning after the second threatening notice appeared on her door, she decided to walk straight into their office. A low, windowless building tucked into a corner of the shopping plaza between a dry cleaner and a tax service. Inside, the air was cool and faintly chemical, the kind of place designed to erase individuality, with beige carpet squares and muted lighting that hummed overhead. She waited at the counter while a receptionist, a middle-aged woman with an expression as rigid as the laminated badge around her neck, continued typing without acknowledging her presence. When Anna finally announced her name and explained she had urgent business about her property, the receptionist gave a thin smile and said she would see if someone could spare a moment. The words carried the tone of charity rather than duty, as if Anna were begging for an audience rather than seeking rightful answers. Eventually, she was led to a narrow conference room where Edward Lawson himself waited, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, a pen resting between his fingers as though he had been expecting her. He gestured to the chair opposite, his movements precise, his composure unnervingly calm. Anna explained everything again, her realtor's assurances, the documentation from the previous owner, the absurdity of tearing down a structure that had stood unchallenged for decades. Lawson listened with the faintest tilt of his head, his eyes fixed on her but revealing nothing, and when she finished, he spoke in a voice smooth as glass. "The association operates under current bylaws, Miss Rivers. Your porch, charming though it may be, does not conform. You are, of course, free to contest the decision through legal counsel, but understand that non-compliance will incur consequences." He tapped the pen once against his notes, the sound echoing in the small room, final and sharp. Anna left with her hands trembling, the hollow ache of humiliation gnawing at her chest. It was not only the dismissal, but the way he had looked at her, as if she were a child arguing about rules she could never hope to change. On the walk back to her car, she noticed two residents entering the office, their eyes flicking toward her briefly before sliding away, as though proximity to her marked them with disfavor. By the time she closed the door of her car, she realized that Lawson had accomplished more than rejecting her appeal. He had isolated her publicly, making her the example of what happened to those who resisted. The pressure deepened in subtle, unnerving ways. Within days, she received a citation claiming her trash bins were left out too long, though she knew she had brought them in the same evening. Another notice arrived about excessive weeds in her flower beds, though she spent hours trimming them each week. It became clear these infractions were not about maintenance, but about leverage, each one a reminder that the association could create infractions whenever it pleased. Neighbors began to withdraw further. A man who once waved as he mowed his lawn now turned his back deliberately. The woman with the dog quickened her pace when she passed Anna's house, the leash taut as if dragging both herself and the animal away from contamination. Anna sat on her porch at night, the boards creaking under her restless shifting, and felt the weight of being watched not by one person, but by an entire community that had silently aligned itself against her. One evening, when the air was thick with summer heat and the faint smell of cut grass, she heard a soft knock at her side gate. Startled, she opened it to find Mark Holloway, the elderly widower who lived 2 houses down, his thin frame hunched and his eyes darting as though he feared being seen. He spoke quickly, his voice low, telling her that she was not imagining the hostility. Lawson had made a habit of targeting newcomers, especially those who did not conform quickly, and the porch had become the perfect excuse. "It isn't about the wood, Anna," he murmured, his gaze heavy with regret. "It's about control. If you bend, he owns you. If you don't, he breaks you." She asked why no one spoke out, and he gave a bitter smile, confessing that years ago he had signed off on architectural plans for Lawson's mansion, knowing they skirted legal requirements. Since then, Lawson had kept the neighborhood in check, each silence bought with either favors or fear. Mark admitted he had stayed quiet for too long, but seeing Anna forced into the same trap awakened a guilt he could no longer bear. His words stayed with her long after he left, carried on the night air like a prophecy. She realized she was caught in something larger than a dispute over a porch. She was the latest pawn in a pattern of domination that stretched back years. Every notice, every sideways glance, every silence at the meeting was a part of a machinery Lawson had built to maintain power. She could almost admire the precision of it, how he had turned neighbors into accomplices simply by nurturing their fear of becoming the next target. But admiration quickly hardened into fury, and with it came a fragile kind of resolve. She would not bend, not this time. The next morning, Anna photocopied every document she had, tucking them into a neat folder. She wrote letters to the county clerk and to a local legal aid office, requesting guidance on property rights. She did not know yet if she could win, but she understood that silence would guarantee defeat. Still, as she slid the envelope into the mailbox, she felt the eyes of her neighbors from across the street, watching, judging, calculating. For a moment she wondered if she was reckless, if defiance would only lead to harsher consequences. Yet beneath the fear lay a stubborn certainty. Her porch was not just a structure. It was the line Lawson demanded she erase, and if she allowed it to vanish, then everything she had begun to rebuild in her life would vanish with it. That night, sitting once again on the contested boards, she noticed something different. The street was quiet as always, but the silence no longer felt neutral. It pulsed with expectation, as though the entire neighborhood were waiting to see how far she would go, whether she would surrender or fight. For the first time, Anna did not feel merely afraid of the conflict ahead. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders, not only for her home, but for every neighbor who had ever lowered their gaze rather than speak. She whispered into the night air a vow she barely recognized as her own voice. She would not give Lawson the satisfaction of obedience. The weeks that followed unfolded like a carefully orchestrated siege, each day bringing some new sign of pressure, some new reminder that the association and its president intended to grind her down through attrition rather than confrontation. Yet, beneath the mounting anxiety, Anna found herself clinging to a small ember of determination that refused to be extinguished. That ember grew brighter the day she sat in the dusty county records office, surrounded by shelves stacked with files that smelled of old paper and forgotten disputes, and discovered that the key to her battle was hidden not in her own documents, but in the conspicuous absence of those belonging to Edward Lawson. She had gone there expecting little more than copies of her own property records, hoping to verify the age and approval of her porch, but as the clerk scrolled through digital archives and shook her head, muttering that the relevant files should be here but aren't, Anna felt a prickling sense that something larger was unraveling. Curious, she asked about Lawson's mansion, that sprawling testament to his authority that dominated the cul-de-sac, and after a few minutes of searching the clerk frowned and admitted that there was no recorded deed of ownership, no clear chain of title, only vague notations about annexations and variances that stopped abruptly 20 years earlier, as though someone had deliberately severed the paper trail. She left the office, clutching photocopies of what little she could obtain, her heart racing not with fear this time, but with the intoxicating sense of leverage. If Lawson's fortress was built on a hollow foundation, then his authority was more fragile than anyone dared imagine. That evening she showed the papers to Mark Holloway, who studied them with trembling hands, his eyes haunted by the memories of signatures he had provided long ago. He confessed that when Lawson first arrived in the neighborhood he had pushed aggressively for special permissions, exploiting loopholes and bullying officials until the mansion rose despite whispers of impropriety. Mark had been complicit, signing off as an architect on plans he knew would not withstand scrutiny, and ever since then he had carried the weight of that compromise in silence. Seeing the absence of a deed, he muttered with bitterness that the house itself was nothing but a monument to fraud, and that Lawson's iron grip over the community was rooted in fear that anyone might expose the truth. For Anna, the discovery reframed everything. The porch, the citations, the humiliations at meetings. They were not merely about conformity, but about distraction, a way to keep eyes turned toward petty infractions rather than the gaping illegality that propped up the president's power. She realized that Lawson's aggression toward her might not be random at all, but tactical. By crushing the newcomer swiftly and publicly, he reminded everyone else of the futility of resistance, diverting attention from his own vulnerability. The thought both terrified and emboldened her. Terrified, because she now understood that she was up against a man who could not afford exposure and therefore might escalate without limit. Emboldened, because she held in her hands the one weapon that could shatter his facade. The more she studied the papers, the more convinced she became that she needed professional help. With trembling resolve, she contacted a legal aid office, explaining her situation to a weary-sounding intake clerk who eventually scheduled her for a consultation with a property attorney named Rachel Klein. On the day of the meeting, Anna sat across from the lawyer in a cramped office filled with case files stacked high against the walls, and poured out the entire saga, from the first notice about her porch to the missing deed in the county archive. Rachel listened intently, occasionally interrupting with precise questions, her pen scratching steadily across a legal pad. When Anna finished, there was a silence during which she feared even Rachel might dismiss her as paranoid. But then the attorney looked up with a sharp glint in her eye and said, "If what you're showing me is accurate, the HOA president is sitting in a glass house while throwing stones, and people who live in glass houses shouldn't try to demolish porches." The unexpected humor broke Anna's tension, and for the first time in weeks she laughed, though the sound carried more relief than joy. Rachel outlined the next steps with clinical clarity. They would file an appeal against the HOA's enforcement order, demand an official review of Lawson's property records, and request a stay of penalties until the investigation concluded. It would be a grueling process, she warned, because associations often relied on their ability to outspend and outlast homeowners in legal battles. But the missing deed gave Anna an advantage that could not be easily dismissed. "The question is," Rachel added, leaning forward, "are you prepared for what happens if we corner him? Men like Lawson don't back down. They strike harder." Anna swallowed the knot in her throat and nodded, because backing down was no longer an option. The porch had become inseparable from her sense of self-respect, and losing it now would mean erasing the fragile identity she had only just begun to reclaim. As the weeks turned into months, the case simmered in the background, each filing answered by counterclaims. Each letter met with another threat of fines, but Anna's perspective had shifted. She no longer saw herself as the isolated target of petty harassment, but as the visible crack in a facade of power that had stood unchallenged for too long. Neighbors still avoided her, but occasionally she caught glimmers of something else in their eyes. Not contempt this time, but the cautious hope of people watching to see if perhaps, finally, Lawson's grip could be loosened. Mark became her quiet confidant, sharing stories of others who had once resisted and been driven out, and in his words she detected not only guilt but admiration that she had not yet broken. At night, as she sat on the porch with the documents spread before her like a deck of cards in a high-stakes game, she imagined the mansion across the street not as an untouchable fortress, but as a hollow edifice waiting for the right push to collapse. The midpoint of her struggle arrived not with a single dramatic confrontation, but with the slow realization that the balance of power had shifted in ways Lawson himself might not yet perceive. She was no longer merely defending a porch. She was preparing to expose the illegitimacy of the very man who demanded its destruction. The fear that had once consumed her was still there, sharp and insistent, but it had been joined by a new sensation, one she almost dared to call exhilaration. The awareness that in challenging him she had already begun to unravel the myth of his invincibility. Whatever came next would be dangerous, perhaps ruinous. But as the cicadas droned in the humid night air and the wooden boards beneath her feet held steady despite every threat against them, Anna knew with absolute clarity that surrender was no longer possible. The legal maneuvers did not pass quietly, and it became clear almost immediately that Edward Lawson had sensed the danger in her persistence, because the campaign against Anna began to intensify with a precision that suggested not spontaneous enforcement but deliberate strategy. Within a single week she received 3 separate violation notices. One claimed her exterior light fixtures were non-compliant with community aesthetics, another accused her of leaving gardening tools visible from the street, and a third insisted her mailbox was the wrong shade of white, even though it had been freshly painted by the previous owner and matched half the block. Each notice carried escalating fines, the numbers absurd in their arbitrariness, yet they had the intended effect of weighing heavily on her mind, a constant reminder that every corner of her life was now subject to hostile scrutiny. At the same time, the atmosphere among neighbors grew colder still, as though Lawson had quietly spread the word that Anna's resistance endangered them all. People who had once exchanged pleasantries now averted their eyes, children were called indoors when she walked past, and invitations to neighborhood events that she had never attended but at least received stopped appearing in her mailbox. Isolation thickened around her house like fog, and she could almost feel the unspoken pressure urging her to surrender simply to restore the illusion of harmony. Yet each new attempt to push her down only hardened her resolve, because the knowledge she now carried about Lawson's missing deed made every threat seem less like law and more like desperate theater. Mark Holloway continued to visit her quietly, sometimes late in the evening when the street was empty, and shared whispers of how Lawson had long manipulated the board and silenced dissent. Once, as they sat on her porch with cups of lukewarm tea, he admitted that several years earlier another homeowner had tried to challenge the HOA over property assessments, and within months his house had been subject to relentless inspections until he finally sold at a loss and left the state. "That's what Edward does," Mark said, his voice low and bitter. He wears you down until leaving feels like mercy. But you've got something he can't afford to face. Truth. His words both comforted and unsettled her, because they underscored what she already suspected, that the closer she came to exposing Lawson, the more vicious his tactics would become. Rachel Klein, her attorney, filed motions demanding discovery of Lawson's property records, and though the process moved at the glacial pace of bureaucracy, each filing seemed to provoke a new wave of retaliation. One afternoon, Anna came home to find a bright yellow placard staked in her front yard declaring her property under violation review. The words printed in bold letters large enough for every passerby to see. She tore it from the ground with shaking hands, but the humiliation lingered like a scar, and she realized with a jolt that this was no longer about the porch itself but about branding her publicly as a transgressor, a spectacle meant to deter anyone else from daring to question authority. The breaking point arrived when she received a notice threatening foreclosure if the mounting fines were not paid within 30 days. The amount listed was grotesquely inflated, several $1,000s far beyond anything she owed, and Rachel immediately assured her the claim had no legal standing. But the psychological impact was undeniable. Anna lay awake at night imagining sheriff's deputies arriving with eviction papers, her belongings piled on the lawn while Lawson watched from his mansion, triumphant. Fear twisted through her stomach like wire, yet beneath it smoldered the undeniable sense that if she allowed herself to yield, the system would consume her entirely. What Lawson did not anticipate was that his escalation also deepened Anna's determination to fight. Rather than retreat, she doubled her efforts, gathering statements from anyone who would speak to her. At first, the neighbors refused, terrified of reprisal, but gradually small cracks appeared in the wall of silence. A retired couple whispered to her that they too had been fined repeatedly for minor infractions until they capitulated. A single mother confessed that Lawson had threatened to revoke community privileges for her children unless she paid inflated, late fees. None of them were willing to testify openly, but their stories formed a mosaic of abuse that gave Anna the strength to keep going. Late one evening, as thunder rolled across the horizon and the street lay in shadow, Anna received an envelope slipped under her door. Unlike the official notices, this one bore no logo, just a single sheet of paper with the words scrawled in uneven handwriting. Stop digging. Some things are better left buried. The message chilled her, not because of its vague menace, but because it confirmed what she already feared, that Lawson or those loyal to him were watching her every move. She showed it to Rachel, who warned her to keep a record of everything, but the attorney's furrowed brow betrayed concern that went unspoken. Intimidation was escalating from bureaucratic harassment into personal threat. Anna sat on her porch that night as the storm finally broke, rain hammering against the roof, lightning illuminating the empty street, and she realized with a clarity that left her trembling that the battle had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer just defending a porch against arbitrary rules. She was exposing a system built on silence and intimidation, and Lawson knew it. Every notice, every threat, every whispered warning was a sign that she had struck at the core of his power. The escalation was dangerous, perhaps even reckless, but as the thunder echoed across the neighborhood and her porch stood firm beneath her feet, she felt for the first time that she was not merely reacting to his moves, but forcing him into a corner, where the truth could no longer be ignored. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and disinfectant, and as Anna sat at the long oak table beside her attorney, she felt as though every nerve in her body had been wired to the ticking of the clock above the judge's bench. The weeks of threats, fines, and sleepless nights had brought her to this moment, where the battle over her porch was suddenly dwarfed by what hung in the balance. Not only her right to keep the structure, but the exposure of the secret Lawson had worked for decades to bury. Edward Lawson entered with his characteristic calm, flanked by two board members who carried stacks of files like soldiers bearing shields, and when he sat across from her he offered a faint smile that looked more like a smirk, the expression of a man who believed the outcome had already been secured. His attorney, sleek and confident, immediately began by reciting the HOA bylaws, stressing that compliance was mandatory, that structures deemed non-conforming must be removed regardless of sentiment, and that Anna's refusal to obey placed her in breach of contract with the community. Every word landed like a hammer, designed to reduce her fight to a matter of simple rule-breaking. But Rachel Klein was prepared, and when it was her turn she rose without hesitation, her voice steady, her presence commanding. She acknowledged the bylaws but argued that enforcement could not exist in a vacuum divorced from legality, and she presented the evidence Anna had uncovered, holding up copies of the county records that showed the absence of a valid deed for Lawson's mansion. The courtroom shifted as murmurs rippled through the spectators. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. Rachel explained that while the HOA had demanded the demolition of Anna's porch, its own president had been residing for years in a property whose ownership was not legally documented, and that such a discrepancy raised serious questions about the authority under which he imposed rules on others. Lawson's attorney objected, insisting the matter was irrelevant, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand, stating firmly that questions of property legitimacy were indeed relevant when the enforcer's authority rested upon them. Anna sat rigid, her palms damp against the table, watching Lawson for the first sign of breakage. His smirk had faltered, replaced by a tightening around the jaw, though he kept his composure as his lawyer scrambled to present supposed records that were hurriedly entered into evidence. Rachel examined them coolly and pointed out glaring inconsistencies. Signatures dated years after the supposed signatories had passed away, notary stamps that no longer existed, and clerical formatting that did not match official county standards. The judge requested verification from the clerk's office, and when the report returned it confirmed what Rachel had suggested. Many of the documents were forgeries, and the chain of title for Lawson's mansion was broken, leaving its ownership in question. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that changes the air in a room. Lawson's composure cracked then. His hand tightened on his pen until it snapped, ink spilling onto the papers before him, a dark blot spreading like the truth he had tried so hard to contain. Rachel pressed further, explaining that if Lawson's ownership was invalid, then his eligibility to serve as HOA president was equally void, meaning every enforcement action under his leadership could be called into question. The judge, his voice deliberate and firm, announced that not only would Anna's porch demolition order be suspended indefinitely, but the matter of Lawson's property and his presidency would be referred for further legal investigation. For Anna, the moment landed like a physical release, years of tension collapsing in a single breath. She had not only defended her porch but torn open the facade of a man who had ruled the neighborhood through fear and manipulation. Lawson remained seated, his face pale beneath the courtroom lights, but she could feel the shift in the room. The neighbors who had come out of curiosity now stared at him with a mixture of shock and quiet vindication. The board members beside him, shifting uncomfortably in their seats as though distance might save them from his downfall. Anna's eyes met his just once across the table, and in that fleeting moment she saw not authority but raw panic in his gaze, the recognition that his empire of silence was crumbling around him. When the gavel struck to close the session, Anna did not rise immediately. She sat for a long moment, listening to the shuffle of footsteps, the hushed voices, the heavy doors swinging open. The porch still stood waiting for her at home, the same boards that had carried her through endless nights of doubt, but it was no longer just a structure. It had become the symbol of resistance that cracked the armor of a man who thought himself untouchable. And as she finally stood to leave the courtroom, the weight she carried felt lighter than it had in months, not because the battle was over, but because she had proved to herself and everyone else that it could be fought, and won. The days after the hearing unfolded with a strange quiet that felt almost unnatural, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen now that Edward Lawson's power had been cracked open for everyone to witness. For Anna, returning to her porch was like stepping into a space transformed. The familiar boards beneath her feet no longer just contested wood, but a small victory platform where she could finally breathe without dread. The letters and fines that had once arrived with suffocating regularity stopped altogether, and while the association remained in place on paper, its meetings grew tense and uncertain, board members unable to pretend that nothing had changed. The neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid her now lifted their hands in cautious greetings, their eyes flickering with something that might have been respect, or perhaps simply relief that someone had finally dared to face the man they had all feared for so long. Lawson himself retreated from public view, his mansion standing like a stranded monument to arrogance, its windows dark and its once perfectly manicured lawn beginning to show signs of neglect. Rumors spread that investigators were combing through his records, that the city was preparing to take action on the forged documents, and that he might soon face charges far beyond the scope of neighborhood disputes. When Anna passed his house, she no longer felt the knot of intimidation in her stomach. Instead, she saw it for what it was, a hollow shell propped up by lies, destined to crumble without the fear that had sustained it. Mark Holloway visited her one last time, his steps slow but steady, and told her that her fight had lifted a weight he had carried for decades, giving him the peace he had thought forever lost. He gripped her hand with surprising strength and whispered that the porch had saved more than just her dignity. It had given the whole street a second chance at honesty. On a warm evening, not long after, Anna sat once again with her coffee, watching the sky darken into deep blue while cicadas sang in the hedges, and she realized that the true victory was not simply keeping the porch, but reclaiming her sense of belonging. The house no longer felt like a fragile refuge, but like a place rooted firmly, its small wooden steps stronger than any mansion built on deception. Neighbors strolled past and nodded without fear, and the silence that once pressed on her with hostility now carried only the ordinary peace of a suburban night. The war that had begun with a letter had ended with the revelation of a truth too large to ignore, and though the scars of the struggle would linger, Anna knew she had chosen the harder path and emerged stronger. Her porch, once a target, now stood as the quiet symbol of a battle won, not just for herself but for every voice that had been forced into silence, a reminder that even the most ordinary places can become the ground where power is tested and where courage proves its worth.